The border issue is finally on the radar of Americans and American politics. Of course, that depends on which border we're talking about. Are we talking about the Russia-Ukraine border, which a lot of people want to talk about, or are we finally talking about the United States' own border and our national security? At least they're both in the conversation right now, and we have nobody better to help us untangle this mess than the ever popular Doug Macgregor. Doug, thanks for coming back on the show today, because I know this is something you and your organization care a lot about, the U.S. border.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and the border has been almost shut down in terms of media attention by most of the mainstream, and the situation today is worse than it's ever been in our history.
Yes, indeed it has, and that's really strange to me. Why there truly is so much focus on the other border across the sea, 6,000 miles away, and not so much on ours. When even the American public, the shocking number, I believe it's like 85%, list this as the number one issue that's going to motivate what they vote on in November. And you would think that ordinarily would be like a hive of action for every politician to try to tap into. But instead, it's almost like they're trying to suppress that to keep the focus on Russia, Ukraine, and at the exclusion of the border. I find that a little odd, even for politicians.
Well, it's not odd if you understand where the money comes from. The voters are not paying anybody any money. They'll tell you right away, everybody in Washington, voters don't win elections, donors do. Well, donors not only win elections, they own the politicians, and the donors are not interested in what happens at the border. The people with the real money who are buying up political support on the Hill are supportive of all the things overseas that we think are catastrophic. And then more important, they don't care about the border. In fact, I'm afraid a lot of them are interested in seeing our population decimated as a relatively homogeneous and cohesive society. We really were, for most of our history, remarkably cohesive as a society, and that's gone. We have millions and millions of people inside the United States. We've got probably 30 million or more illegals, and then we've got another 30 or 40 million. They have citizenship, but how many of them are actually Americans in the true sense of the word? I mean, many of them have simply come here to buy their way somehow or another into the big consumption machine. You get a ticket of admission, and it's sort of a financial Disney World, at least until the finance sector crashes and the economy tanks.
So tomorrow, or maybe it's the day after tomorrow, belatedly, both Trump and Biden are going to be heading down to the border, because I think that they're finally saying, okay, well, donors are one thing, but if the people are finally screaming a lot about this, let's go ahead and actually look at the border situation right now, especially because it's at the center of the Democrats and the current administration's attempt to get money for Ukraine. I think it's pretty clear they're not going to get it until the border issue is addressed. Now, you have been talking about this for quite a while. In fact, here are a couple of tweets that you've had out recently, both from your organization and from your own account, where you show, look, number one, all this money for all these other countries, and zero is being even looked at, especially by the Senate, for the border. But then you also exposed that it's not just about the border. Everybody, or a lot of people anyway, like to focus on the national security implication, and why not? There's big issues with that. But you're showing that in addition to the fentanyl and the drug problem, that it also has a lot, that there's another one that's kind of under the radar, which your organization seems to be highlighting here, is that the human trafficking issue and with children is just insane. And I think deserves a lot more focus than what it's gotten.
Well, I hope all of your viewers have taken the time to go see Sound of Freedom, which was a brilliant film that documents all of the kinds of things that we're talking about. Now, they don't document all the sources and people who are engaged in child trafficking, but they give you a damn good glimpse into the horrors. And you can't even begin to imagine how bad it is. I mean, there are people that have come all the way from Ukraine, children, who have been smuggled out and end up being carried into the United States, and God knows what happens to them. How many thousands? Well, it depends on those that you can identify and count and those that you never count. So what are we talking about? 60,000 a year, 50,000 a year, 80,000 a year, children that just come in and disappear. There appears to be a real market for pedophilia in the United States. And there's no real penalty for it.
Yeah, and I think it's worse than what some people understand. Obviously, our country, our choice does, but for our viewers who may not know, let me show you a couple of recent productions here, things that were shown online that underscore exactly what you just said.
We're right here on the borderline, and right here is just another shelter on the line of the border. What do you do down here at the border?
My name is Butterfly. I've been coming down here 3 years, and my job is to stop child trafficking. All trafficking, but number one, child trafficking down here.
Yeah, because it looks like down here, what do we have going on down here in this shelter? It looks like there's food for everybody. So are you guys bringing in this food?
No, this is the Samaritans and No More Deaths. This is a controlled camp. This is no different than the other side of the wall. They work with the cartels to keep the human traffic line going.
The NGOs do?
Yeah.
So they're human trafficking people here in the United States working with the cartel?
Absolutely. It is government-funded, cartel-run child trafficking, human trafficking.
So most people think that people that come over are adults or their families, but there also are just little kids that come all over by themselves, correct?
I had one time where 38 children between the ages of 4 and 14 came through at 10 in the night by themselves without. These are all unaccompanied minors, all on the traffic line.
I just found that stunning that the NGOs are actually helping issues with the cartels on our borders to the demise of our children or any children. It doesn't matter whose they are. It's just extraordinary and painful to watch.
Well, Hebrew immigration aid is a big one. Mr. Mayorkas, who currently is the director of Homeland Security, that's kind of an oxymoron. He is a former board member of Hebrew Immigration Aid. So I'm sure he's doing everything he can to ensure that these non-governmental organizations are funded. Then you have Catholic Charities. And I've talked to people in the Catholic Church, priests and others, and they claim the church is not directly involved, but it has the name Catholic Charities, and they're a huge participant in all of this. You've got to go down also, as you know, to Panama, to Darien, where Michael Young has done such excellent work documenting and displaying for the public, these massive camps that have been built up there along this terrible trafficking line that runs all the way up to Mexico. Then of course, we have also the child trafficking problem here inside the United States. How many children disappear every day in San Francisco, New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, Seattle, any number of different places. But the bottom line is none of this is an accident. This is being carefully orchestrated. It is strategically supported, and it has one clear, unambiguous aim, and that is to dilute the American population to the point where we have a nation of people with no national identity, no national culture, and no national loyalty. That's what people in Washington seem to want. And I say Washington because I know it's popular to blame everything on the left, but none of this could happen without substantial support from the supposed right, which increasingly is a faux right. It's not real. That's why we talk about a uniparty, and everybody's in it for the same thing, for money. And then if you stop and consider the numbers of events we've witnessed over the last few years involving members of the Senate and the House engaged in all sorts of sexual perversion and impropriety in and around the Hill, we don't even know how much drug abuse or drug use goes on. It was always a place where there was lots of alcohol intake.
Yeah.
It's sort of Sodom and Gomorrah on the Potomac. And
well, it is, and it's ironic in a certain sense because Dr. Phil, who's kind of made a living out of talking about all those kinds of awful things, and now seems to be finding a bit of a conscience, and even he's turning to this issue. Check this out.
I talked to the head of all the border guards down there, the head of the union. I asked him straight up, kids are coming over the border with numbers written on them, phone numbers and addresses. Mm-hmm. Do we check those out? He said, well, we call them. Is it possible that we're sending them into known prostitution rings or sweatshops? He said, it's not possible. It is absolute. We are using American tax dollars to ship children into known prostitution and sweatshops.
Some children.
Well, who knows? Okay. They say that they're so overwhelmed with processing that that's all they can do. They've become social workers and processors and not investigators and border guards because they're just processing.
the scale of what we're talking about here is just stunning. And as you say, it's not just at the border, but it's even within our own cities. I just can't imagine how this thing is continuing to go on at the scale that it is.
There is a name that American citizens should become familiar with. That name is Lee Kuan Yew. He is the man that founded and built up Singapore into a very successful city-state and a very wealthy and prosperous city-state in Asia. Lee Kuan Yew encountered all sorts of opposition inside his own society, but specifically from wealthy individuals that wanted to stop Lee Kuan Yew from building the society that he built. And one of the things that he had to do to stop the criminality that was so widespread, the drug use especially, but all of the things we're talking about, was by executing criminals. Now, everybody says, oh, execute a criminal? We Americans used to do a pretty thorough job of that for a long time, which is why we had rule of law and law and order in our cities. We're not doing anything. There's no reason for any criminal out there to be terribly concerned about what might happen to him if he's arrested. Chances are the judge will find a reason to let him go. The prisons are already too full, or some sort of slap on the wrist so that he can return to business as usual. We don't have the rule of law inside the United States any longer. There's none on the border. And, if we go back to, and some of your viewers will remember this particular incident, the incident that happened in New Mexico when Pancho Villa came up and rode into the United States. And I think a handful of Americans, I think it was about 11 Americans were killed, 16 were wounded. And you know what happened? We put 100,000 National Guardsmen on the border with Mexico. And Woodrow Wilson sent 25,000 troops in the regular army into Mexico. Everybody thinks, well, they went in to find Pancho Villa. They did, but they really focused on driving the chaos of the revolution and the widespread criminality south and away from the American border. That's how concerned we were over our losses then. 11 American dead and perhaps 16 wounded. And what are we dealing with today? 110,000 dead Americans every year just from fentanyl?
Yeah.
And we add to that what you're talking about, what is being done to children. People call themselves Christians and they subsidize this. That's beyond belief. Who are these people that say they're Christians and are down there making this happen? The president of El Salvador is being celebrated as a hero at CPAC, but I haven't run into anybody in Washington who wants to do what he's done. And we're going to have to do a lot more if this country is to survive.
Well, and we have I guess a near-term problem with that. First of all, I believe it was just yesterday, Marco Rubio went on Fox to say what really a lot of people it's kind of self-evident to them, based especially on what we're saying, when he said this.
This is not immigration. We got to stop calling it immigration. It's not immigration. This is a mass migration. This is an invasion of the country. No other country in the world would tolerate it. And we are paying the price for it right now in real time with real American victims.
Meanwhile, at the White House just a couple of days ago on Monday, there was a big powwow meeting with all the heads of the two parties, of the president, of the House, of the Senate, because they are so focused on getting money for Ukraine. But as your tweet pointed out there at the top of this, $0 for the border. And when asked about this issue, even though it's the number one issue on voters' minds, even though it's this huge issue on our border with our children, the leader of the Senate, of the Democratic Senate, was focused on this.
Let me make it clear. We made the overwhelming sentiment in that meeting is we got to do Ukraine now. And there are other issues, including border, which we should address, but not now.
Now, on the House side, and I know that you have some differences of opinion with Mike Johnson, but at least he's focused on what I think is the right focus ahead of Ukraine, which was this.
We need more frank and honest conversations on Capitol Hill, so I was happy to participate in this. We did that as a group, and then I had a one-on-one for a period of time with the president, just he and I in the Oval Office. There was discussion about the supplemental spending package, and I was very clear with the president and all those in the room that the House is actively pursuing and investigating all the various options on that, and we will address that in a timely manner. But again, the first priority of the country is our border and making sure it's secure.
So it looks like it's going to be still a very uphill battle for the White House to get the money on Ukraine once. And by the way, we're going to talk about the issue in Ukraine because the money for Ukraine, the money for the border are now inextricably linked, and you can't talk about one without the other. So we're going to shift to that in just a second. But before we do, I wonder if you can give us kind of your sense of why is the especially the administration and the Democratic Party so laser focused on getting money to Ukraine at the expense of our border?
Well, first of all, in addition to chasing money, politicians also chase public opinion. They don't lead it. It is rare in history that you have a political figure that actually leads public opinion. That is, explains to the American people, or for that matter, the electorate in any society, why it is necessary to do something and then leads them to do it. In reality, they all chase it. And right now, whether you're on whatever side you are on, if you're in the uniparty, you know Americans are focused on the border. And so somebody says, well, you got to go down there. You've got to show them that you care. You've got to demonstrate some interest. And so Biden is going to the border. I'm sure he'll have plenty of ice cream while he's down there, but I don't think it's going to make much difference what he says or does. And by the way, here's President Trump. Will anybody say, Mr. Trump, you promised to build the wall back in 2016. You didn't do it. Why didn't you do it? Your first priority after you were elected was Obamacare, not the border. What I'm trying to tell you is that I don't pay too much attention to what any of these political figures say because they rarely carry through on any of it. And they always want to focus on the things that we've discussed: self-enrichment, what benefits them, what will keep them in office. And that means that you want to make sure your donors are happy. Now, this Mr. Johnson likes to present himself as a serious Christian. Okay, demonstrate it. Show us. I don't see it. And I don't pretend to be one. He does. All right. So this is sickening. How many hundreds of thousands of people are being destroyed every day over in Israel? I don't see him raising his voice. Absolutely not. You know, we haven't even talked about the mass murder in Ukraine. When I say mass murder, I'm blaming the losses on Zelensky and that hideous, evil regime that is established there with our money and influence. The Russians are not the evil ones. They didn't try to push missiles in the face of the United States or Europe. They didn't try to threaten anybody. They were the people being threatened. They were goaded into attacking. They attacked out of self-defense. All right, so we need to get some of these straight, and American voters need to pay attention. Stop listening to what they say. Look at what they do. Look at what they've done. I don't see much evidence that anybody's going to do anything, because if Mike Johnson were serious, he'd just tell the House, we're cutting off everything. We're not spending a dime until we have a secure border. And by the way, until we start apprehending all the criminals that have come into our country and expelled all the illegals. And by the way, look at San Francisco. Look at New York City. Look at these big urban areas. They're disgraces. These are things that have become outposts of criminality and debauchery. And if you go to the so-called developing world, you can find cities that are in better shape where there's more law and order than what we have in our own country now.
Well, and actually kind of to drive that point home, Elon Musk was actually tweeted, I believe it was yesterday. Gary, if you can throw that one up there. He was pointing out that the violence in, I believe it was Venezuela, has dropped significantly, fallen to a 22-year low. And then when you drill in there a little bit lower, you find out that the reason was because they are getting rid of their violent criminals through migration to get rid of them. And where do you think that they're ending up? I mean, that kind of underscores what you were talking about just a second ago.
Oh, gosh. Well, some of you will remember the so-called Mariel boat lift. You know, I was on active duty when President Carter was president, and we were turning the army into a ruin at that point, trying desperately to survive and build on the ruins of what had come out of Vietnam. And what did he do? He took all of Castro's criminals. Castro emptied his jails. Venezuela's emptied its jails. Oh, but they're our friends, aren't they? No, these people are not our friends. They are not coming to do anything good. They're not coming to join in the great American enterprise. No, that's all nonsense. And when I listened to Schumer, he expressed some concern about the survival of Ukrainian civilization. Well, he doesn't give a damn about that and never did. If he cared at all, we wouldn't have been at war. We wouldn't have done what we've done in Ukraine. There would be no proxy war there. This is all ridiculous nonsense. The United States overseas has very clear goals and aspirations that are aligned with our strategic interests. Number one is stability. To have stability, you have to have peace. Without stability and peace, you can't do business. We are a commercial power. We are the greatest commercial power since the British Empire. We're falling apart because we're in pursuit of everything other than commercial interests. And that's killing us. And we may not survive much longer unless this stops dead in its tracks.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it doesn't appear that it is going to stop in its tracks anytime soon, because we're going to have somebody stand up and be willing to do these things that actually has some power. But kind of shifting gears to the Ukraine side of this equation again, matching what you just talked about with Schumer, there was Jake Sullivan a couple of days ago was asked a question about, okay, we've given a bunch of money here, and I'll just kind of stand on my soapbox for a second here. We gave in the first 18 months or so, U.S. and the Western Europe combined north of $200 billion, thousands upon thousands of Ukraine, of our own military equipment, tanks, artillery pieces, trucks of various sizes, millions upon millions of rounds of artillery, also missiles, rockets. I mean, everything you can imagine. And it didn't even dent the Russian lines. And of course, now that we know the Russians are starting to move and have taken Avdiivka, now a few cities or villages even beyond that. And I know you have some updates on what may be coming next. I'm going to talk to you about that in a second. But first of all, and Gary, do we have that one of Jake up? Okay, it's coming in just a second. But you're going to hear him lay out what I think is just nothing but fiction. Well, let me let him say it for himself. Coming up almost there. Sorry, jumped the gun a little bit on that one. But of
course, Ukraine can win. Of course, Ukraine has already succeeded militarily in one of the most profound objectives it had, which was to keep the country from falling into Russian hands. It has already done that. And Ukraine can go further in retaking territory that Russia has occupied, but it can only do so if it has the tools that it needs. And that is why the United States needs to deliver the aid package that passed on a massive bipartisan vote in the Senate. The House needs to step up and pass that bill.
So, Doug, let me just ask you on that first narrow point, first of all, is he right? Is it a matter of tools? Just darn it, if only Ukraine had the tools, and this package will put those tools in there. If we give them those tools, is that going to change the reality on the ground?
And no, he's lying. You know, this is just another lie in a series of lies and fiction that we've been hearing now for the last couple of years. Ukraine, truthfully, never had a chance. You can't build an army on the fly. We've given everything that we possibly could and more. They're probably, in many ways, if we went back and looked at everything that's being given to them, they probably today, had they not fought, but we'd given them all this equipment, would be better equipped and better ready to do something than the United States Army, which you and I know is falling apart. I mean, they just cut 24,000 slots from the Army. It's down below 450,000. I don't know who anybody thinks the U.S. Army is ready to take on, but it certainly isn't very much, because that's less people in uniform than Ukraine has already lost in the war.
That's
500,000 Ukrainian soldiers are dead. Now I'm being told 520 to 530,000, because as long as somebody resists somewhere, they're going to be killed. And we're down below 450,000. So no, it's a huge lie. There's no chance whatsoever. But if you are deeply invested in the lie, what do? You continue to lie. They lied about the Soviet Union up until the day it collapsed. They kept insisting that it was a utopia on Earth, that it was a righteous and moral and wonderful place. No, it never was. It was the opposite, but that wasn't abundantly clear until it completely fell apart. People like Solzhenitsyn and others who told the truth had to leave the country, and even when they went into exile, they were still largely ignored. So I think it's just a lie. But lying is what you do when you have no choice, because the truth is too devastating to admit.
But so here's the thing, though, Doug. I mean, that you just talked about the Soviet example where they were lying about their own country until it literally disintegrated under their feet. But the same thing we did, just a couple of years ago, it was finally exposed with Afghanistan of claiming year after year things were getting better, they were improving, they were getting less corrupt, et cetera, until it literally disintegrated under our feet in our humiliating strategic withdrawal. Now, in that case, that was embarrassing for us, but it didn't really cost us anything. But now that we're doing the same thing again here, and I think you've got some information about some current potential Russian moves on the ground right now that might possibly hasten the expulsion or the explosion of the truth coming out, but imposing itself on top of our fiction. And you can only go the fiction so far before it imposes itself on you. And I just don't see why you would want to go rationally if you can't keep covering it up before it blows in your face.
Well, there's a wonderful scene at the end of the movie Downfall or Untergang, where one of the women who was working as a secretary or a nurse inside Hitler's bunker in Berlin turned to Hitler when he announced that the war was lost and he was about to go into his room and shooting himself. And she said, "But mein Führer, what happened to the inevitable victory?" There were people that were so utterly brainwashed that until the Soviet forces finally entered the city itself, refused to believe the truth. We've got them in Washington, D.C. It's a bubble. So if you look at Ukraine today, there are an estimated 110,000 or more Russian troops now headed from Kupiansk to the west and north, ostensibly for the purpose of ultimately, I think, taking Kharkov. And then there's another group of 90,000+, probably 100,000 by now, moving toward Dnipro. And of course, the bridges over the Dnieper River there are intact. And I imagine that they will cross at some point, and some will go north towards Kiev, and some will probably go south, because I think ultimately Odessa will also be seized. And now that Moldova was brought into NATO over the objections, by the way, of most of the electorate, that was something the government did without consulting the population. The 220,000 Russian citizens living in Dniester are calling on Moscow for help and protection because they've been blockaded by Moldova at the insistence of Brussels and Washington. So I imagine that once Odessa falls into Russian hands, they'll just seize the territory all the way up to the border with Moldova that encompasses Transnistria and all the way to the border with Romania. That means that Ukraine will return to what it has been over the last 1,000 years, with very few exceptions, a landlocked country. So the entire war has been nothing but a complete and utter disaster for Ukraine, for Ukrainian people, for the Europeans. And I wish the Europeans would wake up. They are still struggling. They're going through the same thing the Soviets did up until the bitter end, and the same thing that the Nazis went through up to the bitter end. It's very sad.
We is very sad, Doug.
And it's follow that example. That's the point.
Right. And unfortunately, as some of our viewers here have put up on the screen, we need some strong leadership, because that's the only thing that's going to turn this around. And unfortunately, in light of everything you just said, here's what our leader is still pressing to this day.
And Ukraine, I think the need is urgent. I hope we get to speak to that a little bit. And I think the consequences of inaction every day in Ukraine are dire. I've been speaking to some of our G7 partners, and you just got back, Chuck. They're very concerned. And
the consequences of inaction. I mean, the only thing that if you took nukes off the table, which you can't, but if you did, the only thing that would turn the situation around on the ground is if you introduce NATO ground forces, which Macron was trying to, I think, very poorly try to say, oh, those are on the table. No, they're not really on the table. No one's stupid enough, I don't think, to actually send troops on the ground into Ukraine. But short of that, the only inaction that's going to cause this to go problem is to not take the action to end the war, to find a negotiated settlement. So Biden is talking about inaction of giving cash, as like if we just throw a bunch of dollars at the Russian side, maybe they'll, I don't know, choke on the dollar bills or something. That's probably a better chance than that these tools, so-called, would actually change anything on the ground in Ukraine. But that's where we are.
Well, it might be worth mentioning that the Russian General Staff has been directed to look into the mobilization of an additional 800,000 men. Now, why would they do that? They would do that because they are privately convinced that no one will negotiate an end to this thing. And if no one negotiates an end to it, what have you got to do? you've got to go west. They're not interested really in crossing that river other than to secure Odessa. They don't. They never have. In fact, the Russians would have stopped this war on the basis of those negotiations in Istanbul,
Istanbul,
we
yeah.
know of. We know that Johnson went over there to queer that deal at Biden's request, and there was a deal on the table that everybody could sign up for. This is an unnecessary tragedy, but that's unfortunately unavoidable at this stage, and we'll have to see who steps forward with some common sense and says end it. Now, as far as Europeans are concerned, those armies are not very much different from our own, and I call them boutique armies. What do I mean by boutique? Well, the French army is designed to go on safari in North Africa. The British army is designed to go down and help out people in Belize. This sort of thing. These are not serious warfighting organizations. The German army, which was probably the best in NATO at the time the Soviet state structure collapsed, that's almost non-existent now. They can't field a couple of hundred tanks. They're not remotely trained. So who are we going to send? The best trained army in the vicinity with some strength is probably the Polish force. But the Polish force is woefully inadequate to take on the Russian army. And they've admitted that. Their own chief of staff has said that and announced it. Nobody is going into Ukraine to help the Ukrainians. And how much of that money just ends up being pilfered and stolen by all sorts of people in Ukraine, one of the most corrupt places in the world? Does this mean new yachts and new mansions for Zelensky and his crew? How much of it is used for drug trafficking? How many thousands of Ukrainian children and women are being trafficked out of the country?
Yep.
I mean, let's just go down the list. How many more Javelin anti-tank systems does the cartel in Mexico need that they've already got many of them? How many more do they want to buy? The whole thing is a disaster. This is a ship with no one at the helm. The people that are running the show are all corrupt, and no one seems to have the guts or the brains to stand up and say stop. And that's why I go back to Johnson. I'm sure he means well, but it's all inadequate. It's meaningless. If he had any sense at all, he would stand up there and he'd say stop. We're not spending another dime on anything for any reason until that border is absolutely locked down. And if that means we have to bring forces back from Europe right now because we know we're building a big base in Poland, we are spending a lot of money there to support those soldiers because they are all subsisting on contract messing, food, water. We don't have anybody in the army anymore that provides any real logistical backbone. So you've got an army with far too few people in it that can fight and no real logistical support structure. I mean, the whole thing is a joke. So bring them back, put them on the borders, not just the Mexican border. We get problems on the Canadian border and all through the Great Lakes where we have huge drug trafficking problems. No one brings it up. No one talks about it. It just isn't important in Washington. Yeah. But if you wanted to go down in history, like Henry Clay or any number of really powerful figures in legislative history, that's what Mike Johnson would do. It's time for that. But where are the American patriots? Where are those who care about the American people, the survival of our country? If anybody did, none of this would go on. So I'm anxious to hear what everybody says who visits the border, President Trump and President Biden. And I'm sure President Trump will tell everybody, this would never have happened if I were president. Maybe, maybe not. I mean, this is a very dangerous thing to stand around and say, well, Putin would never have done this because he was afraid of me. No, it's had nothing to do with fear. These are not personal matters. Other people act in the interests of their country.
Yeah.
We need to do the same.
And it just seems, though, Doug, that we're acting in. And Gary, I've thrown you several curveballs already. Don't know if you have any of these up, but we've had several clips recently where you see like Victoria Nuland, Secretary of State Blinken, talking about, where the real focus is, and that's on the cash that this brings to the military-industrial complex. There's no shortage of people, to include the President of the United States. I actually saw a video from him earlier this morning from a little bit further back, bragging about how all of this money that they're trying to get passed in this supplemental, hey, that goes to our military-industrial complex. This goes to our people. It's great. It's a win-win. It is, to quote the actual Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. And I guess this kind of circles back to your original point that you made earlier in this show, that It's all about the money. And when the money's coming in and the money keeps pouring in, why not keep the trough open?
By the way, we have to remember that the bulk of this money is going right back into the U.S. economy to make those weapons, including good-paying jobs in some 40 states across the United States.
She literally just unbelievable. That's just one of the many.
The complete absence of moral turpitude is shocking. There is no moral compass anywhere inside the Beltway. And this is one of the things that periodically come up for discussion in Our Country, Our Choice. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people talk about their Christian values. We also had some Muslims that talked about those values, which are surprisingly close in many ways.
Yeah.
And there are others who are Hindus, but everyone says the same thing. There is no moral compass. It's just not there.
Right. I agree.
So in addition to no strategy, no strategic direction, no leadership, as far as I can tell, there's no moral compass whatsoever. So without that, how much longer can we last, Dan?
And of course, that's the problem. And I really kind of touched on that a second ago when my concern, which you just kind of added to a little bit on what could happen in Russia's situation, when our nonsense and our unwillingness to talk about reality in the Afghan situation, where it was equally clear it was disintegrating, it just caused an embarrassment. But something like this could actually cause a little bit more serious problem if this one collapses under, because then there probably will be all kinds of people, especially in Eastern Europe, that are screaming and going, oh my God, Russia just took all this area here. Now they're coming after us. Now everybody's going to want to build up World War III. And by the way, to your point a second ago, and let me not keep you too much longer here, but NATO right now, unknown to most people because they're focused on so many other issues, that's kind of slid under the radar. But right now, 90,000 NATO troops are right on the Russian border doing this.
It's actually 90,000 NATO troops exercising together to prepare for various contingencies, most notably to prepare for any sort of Russian incursion on NATO territory. NATO allies have come together to reinforce and fortify the eastern flank. We're moving troops to the eastern flank. We're enhancing our deterrence and defense and sending a very strong signal to Russia that he should never consider touching NATO territory.
Russia has no interest in touching any NATO territory. Putin himself keeps saying, look, if you get into a NATO and Russia war, it's nuclear and everybody loses. He's saying that. So, but we don't seem to be thinking logical like that. And I think that I haven't seen any of the reports, but if these rumors you talked about are true, that the Russians are actually looking at a mass mobilization because they see stuff like this, they hear all of these leaders in NATO talk about how, I think World War III is coming. We have 3 to 5 years to get ready for Russia. If the Russians see the Western nations doing this, if they see them putting all this money in killing their troops, I mean, at some point they're going to say it's stupid for us not to get ready for that outcome. And of course, then you have this mutually building fear of each other. And that's what leads to a lot of wars. And so we're going down a path right now, to your point earlier, actually you made a couple of times now, that our foolish our actions here of chasing money, ignoring morality, ignoring reality on the ground could lead us into catastrophe.
No, I think so. But I also think, Mr. Putin is a rational man. He's very reasonable. He's never wanted any of this. He really wants to get back to some sort of state of normalcy with the West and do business. But as you say, he has to respond to what he sees develop. Right now, we have Americans moving in to create bases in northern Finland and Sweden. Now, here's Sweden, and internally is falling apart. It's fighting criminality in its own cities to the point where it has to commit its army to the streets. And at the same time, we want to put bases up in the north and potentially with missiles to threaten Russia. If you're a Russian, you look at this and shake your head in disbelief because it makes no sense. But on the other hand, as you point out, you're obligated to protect yourself and to respond. So I don't know what will happen, but I'm hoping that there will be some degree of sobriety emerge in places like Berlin. It certainly exists in Budapest. It could exist in Warsaw because I don't think the majority of Poles, based on the latest data I've seen, polling data, are interested in the war with Russia. But then you have people like Andrzej Duda, the president or prime minister, whatever he is, he shows up in Paris and says, Russia is a place that just really shouldn't exist. I mean, you make statements like that leads people in Moscow to a conclusion that they don't have any choice in the matter, that they have to be prepared to do the things that you're outlining. So, yeah, you're right. Now, could President Trump, if he were elected, turn that around? Could President RFK Jr. do something about it? Potentially, but nothing's going to happen quickly, contrary to what anybody says.
Yeah,
because we've destroyed decades of trust and mutual confidence, replaced all of it with mutual suspicion, fear, and distrust. By the way, I think RFK Jr. should give the White House a call and ask President Biden to remove the bust of his father from the Oval Office, because it seems as though Biden wants to be photographed with Bobby Kennedy's bust. I can't conceive of Bobby Kennedy seeing anything positive in Joe Biden under any circumstances.
right. And actually, I wanted to kind of bolster what you just said about Putin. So here's what he see. I'm going to show you something from actually 2 weeks before the war started, where he was trying to I guess to say, here's where we are, here's what I'm thinking, and here's where I'm willing to not go, and here's where I'm willing to go if pushed into doing so. And tell me if you think anything has changed in the 2 years since then.
Я хочу еще раз все-таки подчеркнуть это. Я говорил, но мне очень бы хотелось, чтобы вы меня услышали все-таки в конце концов. И донесли это до своих читателей, зрителей и пользователей в интернете. Но вы понимаете или нет, что если Украина будет в НАТО и военным путем будет возвращать себе Крым, европейские страны автоматически будут втянуты в военный конфликт с Россией. Конечно, значит, потенциал объединенной организации НАТО и России несопоставим. Мы понимаем. Но мы также и понимаем, что Россия одна из ведущих ядерных держав. По некоторым компонентам, по современности даже многих опережает. Победителей не будет. И вы окажетесь втянутыми в этот конфликт помимо своей воли. И вы даже не успеете глазом моргнуть, когда будете исполнять пункт 5 Римского договора. Господин президент, конечно, не хочет этого развития. И я не хочу. И я не хочу. Поэтому здесь и находится.
The first nuclear warheads have been delivered to the territory of Belarus, but just the first ones. The use of nuclear weapons undoubtedly is theoretically possible for Russia. We have more of these weapons than NATO countries do. They know that, and they keep telling us to start negotiations on reductions. Well, you know what? They can shove it.
So he said there before the war, look, I don't want to go down this path. You don't want to go down this path. Nobody would win. So he's not even theoretically saying, yeah, if it goes down this, we'll do it and we'll win. He knows that everyone would lose then. Doug, why don't we know that?
Well, that's a good question. Part of it is because the people inside the Beltway, as we've discussed before, live in the 1991 fantasy land. They still think that we're capable of outmatching everyone and anyone. They don't do any ends means calculus because they're convinced that our means are inexhaustible, just as they believe that they can print as much money as they like as a substitute for the lack of productivity in our economy and the lack of wealth that we've already squandered on so many failed propositions over the last several years. That's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that I think they continue to, for reasons that make no sense, to grossly underestimate Russia. You know, Russia has an enormous advantage over us in NATO. They're not an alliance. They don't have to put up with it.
Right.
We've always had to put up with
32 people, yeah.
Alliances don't work very well in wars. They do only under the pressure of war for a brief period of time, and then they fall apart. And for good reason, because the interests are never there. And if you were to hoist the emergency signal in Central Europe and say it's time for everybody to mobilize, we're all marching east, I would say 10 or 12 people will show up and ask you, when's this going to happen? And where can I get a bratwurst or something? And that, you know, maybe a free beer, but nobody's going to do that. That's all nonsense. We need to stop talking about it. It's ridiculous and it's unnecessary. And I hope that, and I really do hope that these people that call themselves Christians think through all of this. I mean, I'm a bad Christian. I don't profess to be a great one. And every time somebody tells me what a good one they are, I'm always amazed because I've always found it a very tough road to hoe. But if you look at these people that say, I'm a Christian, well, then how can you participate in so many things that are an atrocity, that are utterly unconscionable in the face of God? So I'm asking the people out there that fall into that category, go back and re-examine your unconditional support for all of these really stupid and bad policies. And then, for God's sakes, focus on the border. And then let's clean up this country. Let's restore law and order. And let's pay attention to who's coming into the country. We don't even know who's here. We haven't known for a long time, Dan. It's very dangerous.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Doug. I mean, I certainly consider myself a Christian, and I am abhorrent to so many of these things that are happening, especially in my name. I mean, you and I fought in a war together to defend our country and for the values and principles that we believe that our country represented. And there has been a sea change in those morals now, if they even still exist. And it angers me, frankly.
And you'll remember something, Dan. When it became very clear that we were not allowed to advance any further, and the enemy in front of us was broken to the point where we were playing tactics or using tactics to try and bring people out of their supposed holes or away from the wreckage so that they could be killed. I said, that's got to stop. We came here to win a battle. We've won the battle. We did not come here to annihilate these people, to kill them indiscriminately. And we called a ceasefire. A lot of people didn't like that ceasefire, but it was necessary. And I think there has to be some feeling like that, and there is none. And, for those out in the audience that believe in karma, that's not a good thing for us.
Right. And if you believe in God like I do, it's even worse because he has the power to do something, not just what's going to happen. But listen, we'll leave it there. But right now, the one shining hope that we do have, though, is that a lot of these people that are on our channel that are listening today, a lot of people who listen to you are these good, genuinely Christian people who don't want all these things done in our name and do want the morality to return back to what actually made America great at points in the past. It's, the goodness, not just, having good policies, but having morals to undergird them, without which I think you have nothing but disaster. And we're glad that we have your organization, our country, our choice, because that's what you're trying to bring back into this. And, as long as we got people like you and God, hopefully that there'll be others around also that will follow that, or even raise up their own groups moving in the same direction. There at least is some hope, because I know there are a great many wonderful American people, really people who could do great leadership if they had the chance to get in there. And I hope we can before some of the worst disasters actually fall on us.
Well, amen.
We'll see how it goes. But thanks so much for joining us today, Doug, and sharing some of these insights. And we always recommend people go to Our Country, Our Choice. If you want to be involved with what Doug's doing over there, certainly that's one good place to get yourself plugged into. So Thanks for coming. And we thank you guys for joining us on Daniel Davis Deep Dive today. Remember, we are unintimidated and uncompromised on bringing you the truth. Even if it's ugly, we're going to bring it to your attention. So if nothing else, we can hold our leaders' feet to the fire and make sure that they're aware that we're watching and holding them responsible and accountable for what they do. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.
Right.